In a quiet town where everyone knows each other, a shocking event turned a peaceful community upside down. Pastor Michael Reynolds, a well-respected leader, was found dead in his own home. He had been living a life that many admired: loving husband, caring father, and a guiding light for his congregation. But behind this perfect image lay a secret that would lead to his tragic end. For 2 years, Michael was in a hidden love affair with David Thompson, a young man who was drawn to the pastor's charm and authority. Their relationship was filled with passion, but also fear of being discovered. As they navigated their feelings in secret, tensions rose. Michael struggled with guilt over his family, while David felt trapped by the shadows of their love. On the night of Michael's death, a heated argument erupted. Words were exchanged, and in a moment of anger, a life was taken. The police would soon uncover the shocking truth, revealing how a secret love could lead to devastating consequences. As the investigation unfolded, the community was left in disbelief. Who would want to harm a man so beloved? How could a pastor, someone looked up to by so many, become the center of such a dark story? Join us as we delve into this tragic tale where love, betrayal, and murder intertwine, shaking the very foundations of trust in this small town. The town of Stonebridge was the kind of place where life seemed peaceful. A close-knit community where neighbors knew each other by name, and Sundays were always marked by church services. Pastor Michael Reynolds had been a part of this town for nearly 2 decades. He wasn't just the leader of the local church, he was a man who people looked up to, admired, and trusted. His sermons were full of wisdom, and his guidance was often sought by those going through hard times. Michael's personal life seemed just as perfect. He was married to Linda, a kind-hearted woman who worked closely with him in church activities. Together, they were the epitome of a strong, loving couple. Linda managed community events, helped with church services, and was always seen with a warm smile, making everyone feel welcome. The town admired them, seeing their marriage as a beacon of stability and grace. From the outside, everything seemed right in their world. But beneath the surface, Pastor Michael was living a different life. For 2 years, he had been hiding a secret that would eventually tear his life apart. David Thompson, a man 15 years younger than him, had become much more than just a member of the congregation. David was a bright, charismatic man who had moved to Stonebridge a few years earlier. He was creative, enjoyed writing, and spent much of his time at a local coffee shop working on personal projects. It was there that he and Pastor Michael had first begun to grow close. Their relationship started innocently enough. Pastor Michael had always taken a special interest in helping young men in the community, mentoring them and offering spiritual guidance. But with David, things were different. Over time, their meetings became more frequent, and their conversations more intimate. What began as casual chats over coffee soon turned into private encounters. Michael found himself drawn to David in ways he hadn't expected. He was a man of faith, yet here he was, living in contradiction to the values he preached every Sunday. The pressure of leading a double life weighed heavily on Michael. His guilt and fear of being discovered began to consume him. Every time he stood in front of his congregation, delivering sermons on morality and truth, he felt like a fraud. He loved his wife, Linda, and cared deeply for his community, but he couldn't deny his feelings for David. For David, the relationship was equally complicated. He had grown fond of Michael, drawn to his wisdom and authority, but the secrecy of their affair took its toll. He felt trapped, knowing they could never openly be together. Despite their affection, there was always an unspoken tension between them, an undercurrent of fear. Michael's position as a pastor, his marriage, and the expectations of the community were all walls that kept them apart, even in moments of closeness. One evening, as Michael sat in his office at the church, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was spiraling out of control. The weight of his secret, the lies he had told his wife, the community's expectations, they all pressed down on him. He had tried, countless times, to end things with David, but each time they would be drawn back together. Michael knew it couldn't go on forever. The pressure was building, and something was bound to give. David, too, was struggling. The secrecy, the late-night meetings, and the fear of being discovered had become overwhelming. He had started to feel like a shadow, living only in the quiet moments they shared in hidden places. He was tired of hiding, tired of feeling like he was someone's secret. In the weeks leading up to the tragic event, Michael became more distant from both David and Linda. He began avoiding David, missing their usual meetings and cutting their conversations short. At home, Linda noticed a change in him. He was more withdrawn, spending long hours at the church, often returning late at night without explanation. When she asked what was wrong, Michael would brush off her concerns, claiming he was just busy with church matters. But Linda wasn't convinced. She knew something was off, but she couldn't put her finger on it. As a pastor's wife, she was used to the demands of the job, the long hours, and the late-night calls. Yet this felt different. Michael seemed troubled in a way he hadn't before, and Linda's intuition told her that something was deeply wrong. And she wasn't the only one who noticed. The congregation, too, began whispering among themselves. Some speculated that Michael was struggling with the pressures of the church, while others thought there might be trouble in his marriage. No one, however, could have guessed the true nature of his turmoil. As the tension grew, both Michael and David found themselves standing at a crossroads. Their relationship, which had once been a source of comfort and passion, was now tearing them apart. Michael felt trapped between his faith, his duties as a pastor, and his feelings for David. David, on the other hand, was growing increasingly resentful of their situation. He wanted more, he wanted to be with Michael openly, but he knew that could never happen. The stage was set for the events that would change everything. What had begun as a secret love affair was about to unravel, leading to a confrontation that neither man could have foreseen. The town of Stonebridge, so peaceful and quiet, would soon be shaken to its core by the shocking revelation of what had been hidden behind closed doors. As the days passed, the tension between Michael and David became unbearable. What had once been secretive rendezvous now felt like emotional battles, leaving both men exhausted. Michael found himself pulling further away from David, not just out of fear of being discovered, but because the weight of his guilt was becoming too much to bear. He spent hours in the church, alone, praying for guidance, asking for forgiveness, and hoping that somehow he could make things right. David, however, was reaching the end of his patience. He had invested so much of himself into this relationship, his feelings, his time, his trust, only to feel abandoned. He couldn't understand why Michael was pulling away, why the man who once seemed so confident and strong now appeared so broken and distant. David's frustration grew, and with it, his desire for answers. One evening, after yet another canceled meeting, David decided to confront Michael. He wasn't going to be pushed aside any longer, left in the shadows while Michael continued to live his life with Linda and the church. David felt like he deserved the truth, even if it meant the end of their relationship. The secrecy, the lies, it had all become too much. David knew Michael would be at the church late that evening, as he often was in recent weeks. He drove over, his mind racing with questions and anger. The usually quiet, comforting atmosphere of the church now felt eerie and cold to David. As he walked through the dimly lit halls, he could hear the faint echo of his footsteps on the old wooden floors. He found Michael sitting in his office, staring at a Bible, though it was clear his thoughts were far from the words on the page. Michael looked up, startled to see David standing in the doorway. For a brief moment there was silence. Neither of them knew what to say. David could feel the weight of the moment hanging between them, thick with unresolved tension. Finally, David broke the silence. He asked Michael what had changed, why he had been avoiding him, why their relationship had turned into something they could barely recognize. Michael, still sitting behind his desk, struggled to find the right words. He had always been able to offer guidance to others, but now he couldn't even find the strength to explain his own actions. Michael tried to tell David that it was over, that their relationship had been a mistake, that it couldn't go on any longer. But the words didn't come out the way he had intended. Instead, it sounded cold, dismissive, as if he was throwing away everything they had shared. David's face fell, his frustration boiling over into anger. He had expected an explanation, some sign that Michael still cared, but instead he felt like he was being discarded. David's voice grew louder as he pressed Michael for the truth. He demanded to know why Michael had led him on if he was just going to turn his back on him now. Why had he let their relationship go on for so long if he was going to end it like this, without any real explanation? Michael tried to calm him down, but his own nerves were frayed, and soon the conversation turned into a heated argument. The church office, once a place of quiet reflection, was now filled with raised voices, accusations, and raw emotions. Michael stood up from his desk, his hands trembling as he tried to reason with David. He told David that his guilt had become unbearable, that he couldn't continue living a lie, and that he needed to focus on his family and his faith. But David wasn't satisfied with that answer. He felt betrayed, like everything they had been through together was being swept under the rug. As the argument escalated, something shifted in David. His anger turned to desperation. He couldn't accept that it was over, not like this. The man he had fallen in love with was standing in front of him, telling him that everything they had shared was a mistake. It was too much to handle. In the heat of the moment, emotions ran wild and words were exchanged that couldn't be taken back. Michael, overwhelmed by the confrontation, turned away from David, trying to distance himself physically as well as emotionally, but David wasn't ready to let him go. He grabbed Michael's arm, pleading with him to reconsider, to at least talk things through. Michael, startled by the sudden physical contact, pushed David away, his frustration and fear coming to the surface. What followed was a blur of movement and act of pure impulse. In that instant, everything changed. What had been a heated argument turned into something far darker. A struggle ensued, brief but violent, as the tension that had been building for months finally reached its breaking point. In the chaos of the moment, a tragic accident occurred. David, in a fit of rage and desperation, shoved Michael harder than he had intended, and Michael stumbled backward, losing his balance. The room seemed to freeze in that moment. Michael fell, his head striking the corner of the desk as he hit the ground. The sound of the impact echoed through the small office, followed by a sickening silence. David stood frozen, his heart racing, unable to comprehend what had just happened. He hadn't meant for it to go this far. It was supposed to be just a conversation, a chance to clear the air, but now Michael was lying on the floor, motionless. Panic set in. David dropped to his knees beside Michael, shaking him, calling his name, but there was no response. Blood began to pool around Michael's head, staining the worn carpet beneath him. David's mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do. He hadn't meant for any of this to happen. He hadn't come here to hurt Michael. It was supposed to be a conversation, not this. In the cold light of the office, the reality of what had happened slowly sank in. Michael Reynolds, the man David had loved in secret for 2 years, was dead. And David was the one responsible. For a moment, David considered calling the police, but fear gripped him. How would he explain this? How would anyone believe that it had been an accident, a moment of passion gone horribly wrong? The town of Stonebridge would never forgive him. They would never understand. He could already imagine the looks of disgust, the whispers behind his back. No, he couldn't let that happen. David knew he had to leave. He couldn't be found here, not like this. Without thinking, he wiped his hands on his jeans, his heart pounding as he stumbled toward the door. He looked back one last time at Michael's lifeless body, his mind reeling. Then, without another word, he fled into the night, leaving behind the scene of the crime that would soon shatter the peaceful life of Stonebridge forever. The following morning, Stonebridge awoke to a quiet Sunday, unaware of the storm that was about to break. The sun rose over the small town, casting long shadows across the streets as people prepared for church. As usual, Linda Reynolds was getting ready for the service, expecting Michael to already be at the church, preparing for his sermon. It wasn't uncommon for Michael to leave early in the morning to spend extra time in prayer or to finish his notes in the peaceful silence of the empty building. But when Linda arrived at the church, something was off. The doors were still locked, and the lights inside were off. It was strange, considering Michael always made sure to unlock the doors and turn on the lights early so that the parishioners could enter. She tried calling his phone, but there was no answer. With a growing sense of unease, she pulled out her spare key and unlocked the door, stepping inside. The church was eerily quiet. The usual warmth of the building felt cold and distant. As she walked through the hallways, calling out for Michael, her voice echoed back at her. Linda's footsteps grew quicker, her anxiety building with each passing moment. Finally, she reached Michael's office. The door was slightly ajar, which was unusual, and as she pushed it open, the sight before her made her gasp. Michael was lying on the floor, motionless, a pool of dried blood surrounding his head. Linda froze, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. For a moment, everything felt unreal, like she had stepped into a nightmare. She rushed to his side, shaking him, calling his name, but there was no response. Michael's body was cold, and it was clear that he had been dead for hours. Linda's scream pierced the silence of the church, echoing through the empty halls. It didn't take long for her cries to draw attention, and soon, members of the congregation who had arrived early for the service came rushing in. The sight of their beloved pastor lying dead on the floor sent shockwaves through the small group. Someone called the police, and within minutes, the church was swarmed with law enforcement. Detective Sarah Johnson was assigned to the case. Known for her no-nonsense attitude and sharp investigative skills, Sarah had seen her share of tragedies, but something about this case felt different. Stonebridge was a quiet town. Violent crimes like this were almost unheard of. As she arrived at the scene, she could already sense that this wasn't going to be a simple investigation. The crime scene was quickly cordoned off, and the church, once a place of sanctuary, was now filled with the sound of police radios and the flashes of cameras as the forensic team began their work. Detective Johnson surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, noting the bloodstains, the overturned chair, and the position of Michael's body. It was clear there had been a struggle, but there were no obvious signs of forced entry. As she began questioning Linda and the other parishioners, it became apparent that Michael had been at the church late the previous night, but no one knew exactly when he had left or who had been with him. Linda, still in shock, struggled to answer the detective's questions. She kept repeating that Michael had seemed distant in the weeks leading up to his death, but she had no idea why. To everyone else, their marriage had appeared strong, but Linda admitted that something had been troubling Michael, though he had never confided in her. As the hours passed, news of Michael's death spread through the town like wildfire. Stonebridge was in shock. How could something like this happen to a man who had dedicated his life to helping others? The questions were endless, and rumors began to circulate. Some whispered that Michael had been the victim of a robbery gone wrong, while others speculated that there had been trouble in his marriage. But no one had any real answers. David Thompson heard about the murder later that afternoon. He had been holed up in his apartment, trying to make sense of the chaos in his mind. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. His mind kept replaying the events of the previous night, the moment when everything had spiraled out of control. The news hit him like a punch to the gut. Michael's death wasn't just a secret anymore. It was out in the open, and the entire town was now talking about it. David was consumed by guilt and fear. He hadn't intended to kill Michael, but the weight of what he had done was suffocating. He could barely bring himself to leave his apartment, too terrified that someone would connect him to the crime. But deep down, David knew that it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. He had been seen with Michael too often. People would start asking questions. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. Detective Johnson continued her investigation, piecing together the fragments of Michael's life in the weeks leading up to his death. She interviewed Linda again, trying to understand what had been troubling Michael. It was during one of these conversations that Linda mentioned David Thompson. She said that Michael had been spending more time with David in recent months, though she hadn't thought much of it at the time. Michael was always mentoring young men in the community, so it hadn't seemed unusual. But now, in the light of his death, Linda wondered if there was something more to the relationship. The mention of David's name piqued Detective Johnson's interest. She made a note to follow up, but for now there were still too many unanswered questions. The forensic team confirmed that Michael had died from blunt force trauma, likely caused by his head striking the corner of the desk. But the autopsy revealed something even more disturbing. There were signs of a struggle, bruises on Michael's arms that suggested someone had grabbed him forcefully before he fell. This new information led Detective Johnson to rule out the possibility of an accidental death. Michael hadn't simply fallen, he had been pushed. This was now officially a homicide investigation. As the investigation deepened, David's name came up more frequently. Several members of the congregation mentioned seeing David and Michael together often, sometimes late into the night. It was clear that they had been spending a significant amount of time together, but no one seemed to know why. Detective Johnson's instincts told her that David knew more than he was letting on, and she decided it was time to pay him a visit. When she arrived at David's apartment, he was a mess. His usually composed demeanor had crumbled, and it was clear that he hadn't slept in days. Detective Johnson's questions were simple at first. When was the last time he had seen Michael? Did he know anything about what had been troubling the pastor? But as the conversation continued, David's nervousness became more apparent. His answers were vague, and he avoided making eye contact. Detective Johnson had seen this behavior before. David was hiding something, and she was determined to find out what. She didn't press him too hard during the initial interview, but she left the apartment with a sinking feeling that David was more involved than he was willing to admit. Back at the station, Detective Johnson began digging into David's background. What she found wasn't incriminating, but it was enough to raise suspicions. David had no criminal record, but his sudden appearance in Michael's life, coupled with the secrecy surrounding their relationship, made him a person of interest. There was more to this story, and Detective Johnson knew she was on the right track. As the days passed, the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to fall into place. Michael's double life was starting to come to light, though not yet in full. There were still secrets to uncover, but it was clear that his relationship with David was central to the investigation. What had begun as a quiet, tragic death in a small town was now unraveling into a scandal that would leave the community in shock. As the investigation deepened, Stonebridge's peaceful facade began to crack. Rumors swirled through the town, each one more shocking than the last. Some suggested that Michael had been having an affair, though few could bring themselves to believe it. After all, he was a pastor, a man of faith who had dedicated his life to the church and his community. But as more details emerged, the truth became harder to ignore. Detective Sarah Johnson's focus on David Thompson intensified. The more she dug, the more she became convinced that David held the key to understanding what had happened to Michael. But David remained elusive, avoiding contact with the outside world as guilt gnawed at him. He knew it was only a matter of time before the police connected him to the events of that night. His every thought was consumed by fear of discovery, fear of losing everything, fear of facing the consequences of his actions. Despite his efforts to stay out of sight, whispers about David and Michael's relationship began to surface. Some members of the congregation had noticed their closeness and wondered if there was more to it than just mentorship. A few even recalled seeing them together in places where they thought Michael shouldn't have been, but no one had dared to confront the pastor directly. Now, in the aftermath of his death, those quiet observations took on a new, darker meaning. Detective Johnson knew that to crack the case, she needed more than speculation. She needed evidence, something concrete that would tie David to the crime. But so far, there was no physical proof linking him to Michael's death. The only thing they had was the growing suspicion surrounding their relationship. Then, one afternoon, a breakthrough came in the form of a security camera. The church had an old, barely functional camera system installed years ago, mostly used for monitoring the exterior of the building. No one had thought to check the footage earlier because the system was known to malfunction frequently, but one of the tech-savvy officers decided to give it a shot. The grainy footage from the night of the murder showed something crucial: David Thompson entering the church late at night. It wasn't a clear image, but it was enough to confirm that he had been there at the time of Michael's death. This was the piece Detective Johnson had been waiting for. Armed with this evidence, she decided it was time to confront David directly. There was no more room for avoidance. He had to face the reality of what had happened. Detective Johnson and her team arrived at David's apartment with a warrant in hand. The knock on the door echoed through the quiet building, sending David's heart into his throat. When David opened the door, the sight of Detective Johnson and the officers behind her told him everything he needed to know. His time was up. There would be no more hiding, no more running from the truth. The look in his eyes said it all. He was a man broken by the weight of his own guilt. As they brought him down to the station, David knew that his life as he had known it was over. At the police station, the interrogation began. Detective Johnson laid out the evidence piece by piece, her calm demeanor masking the intensity of the situation. David, pale and shaking, sat across from her, his hands trembling. She told him about the security footage, about the witnesses who had seen him and Michael together. The walls were closing in, and David knew there was no way out. Finally, after what felt like hours of questioning, David broke down. He couldn't hold it in any longer. The weight of the secret he had been carrying, the lies, the guilt, it all came pouring out. His voice cracked as he told Detective Johnson everything. He recounted how his relationship with Michael had begun, how it had grown into something deeper, and how the secrecy had driven them both to the edge. He confessed to being at the church that night, to confronting Michael about their relationship, and to the heated argument that had spiraled out of control. He described the moment when everything changed: the push, the fall, the sickening sound of Michael's head hitting the desk. He hadn't meant to kill him, but in that moment of anger and desperation, he had crossed a line he could never uncross. David's confession, raw and filled with regret, was enough to confirm what Detective Johnson had suspected all along. It hadn't been a planned murder, but rather a crime of passion, born out of the emotional turmoil between the two men. Michael's death had been an accident, but it was one that David could never take back. With David's confession in hand, the case began to wrap up. The community of Stonebridge was left reeling from the revelations. The town had lost not only their beloved pastor, but also their sense of innocence. People who had once looked up to Michael were now forced to confront the reality that he had been living a double life. The perfect image of the Reynolds family was shattered, leaving everyone to question what they had really known about the man they had trusted. Linda Reynolds was devastated. The man she had shared her life with, the father of her children, had been hiding a part of himself that she had never even suspected. The news of his affair with David hit her like a tidal wave, leaving her struggling to make sense of it all. Her grief over Michael's death was compounded by the betrayal she felt, and though the town rallied around her, offering support, nothing could fill the void that had been left behind. David, meanwhile, was charged with manslaughter. His confession and the evidence against him made it clear that while Michael's death hadn't been premeditated, David's actions had led directly to his demise. The court case that followed was swift, and though David expressed deep remorse for what had happened, it wasn't enough to absolve him of responsibility. He was sentenced to several years in prison, leaving behind the life he had known in Stonebridge. For Detective Sarah Johnson, the case was one of the more difficult she had worked on, not because of the complexity of the investigation, but because of the emotions involved. She had seen many tragic endings in her career, but this one felt particularly poignant. It was a reminder of how fragile life could be, how quickly things could spiral out of control, and how even those who seemed to have everything together could be hiding the darkest of secrets. As the town of Stonebridge tried to move on from the tragedy, the church doors remained closed for a time, a stark reminder of the events that had unfolded within its walls. Life in the small town would never be quite the same again. In the weeks following David's sentencing, Stonebridge remained in a state of quiet mourning. The once bustling town now felt somber, as if the weight of what had transpired cast a permanent shadow over the streets. The church, once the heart of the community, stood closed, its doors locked, and its windows dark. Without Pastor Michael Reynolds, the congregation felt lost, and many struggled to reconcile the image of the man they had trusted with the secrets that had been uncovered. Linda Reynolds, devastated by the dual blow of losing her husband and learning of his affair, had retreated into herself. Her grief was a deep, private thing, and while the townspeople offered their condolences and support, no one could fully understand the extent of her pain. The betrayal she felt ran as deep as her sorrow, and every corner of her home, every memory of her life with Michael, felt tainted by the secrets he had kept. Though she was surrounded by friends and family, Linda felt utterly alone. Her children, too young to fully grasp the complexities of the situation, only knew that their father was gone and their mother was broken. Linda's life, once defined by her role as the pastor's wife, now felt hollow, her identity shattered along with her marriage. In the weeks following the tragedy, Linda struggled with her faith. The church had been her sanctuary, the place where she had built her life alongside Michael. But now, the sight of the building brought nothing but pain. The sermons that once filled her with hope now felt empty, and she found it impossible to step inside without feeling the weight of her husband's betrayal. The community, too, was reeling. Michael's death had left a gaping hole in Stonebridge, and the revelations surrounding his affair with David Thompson had sent shockwaves through the town. For many, Michael had been more than just a pastor. He had been a friend, a mentor, a guide. To learn that he had been living a double life was a betrayal not only to Linda but to the entire community. People who had once turned to him for guidance were now left questioning everything they had known about the man who had preached to them every Sunday. The church leadership struggled to find someone to take Michael's place. No one in the town could imagine filling his shoes, and the process of finding a new pastor was fraught with difficulty. In the meantime, the church remained closed, a reminder of the scandal that had rocked the town. David Thompson, now serving his sentence, found himself isolated in prison. The weight of his guilt and remorse was overwhelming. He had never intended for things to go this way, but in a moment of anger and desperation, he had taken a life. That realization haunted him every day. His life, once filled with promise and potential, was now confined to a cell, and he spent his days replaying the events that had led him here. Though he had confessed to the crime and expressed his remorse, David's guilt was a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. The relationship that had once brought him joy had ultimately destroyed everything he held dear. He had loved Michael, but that love had come at a terrible cost. Now all he had left were memories and the knowledge that he had caused irreparable harm. David's family, who had always stood by him, struggled to come to terms with the truth. They had never known about his relationship with Michael, and the news of the affair, coupled with his involvement in the pastor's death, had been a shock they were unprepared for. Though they visited him in prison, their conversations were strained, filled with unspoken questions and unresolved feelings. David could feel the distance growing between him and the people he loved, and it only deepened his sense of isolation. Back in Stonebridge, the community tried to move on, but the memory of what had happened lingered. For some, the scandal surrounding Michael's death was a topic of hushed conversation, something to be avoided in polite company. For others, it became a source of gossip, a cautionary tale about the dangers of living a double life. But for most, it was simply a tragedy, an event that had shattered the town's sense of peace and left behind a trail of unanswered questions. Detective Sarah Johnson, having closed the case, found little solace in the resolution. She had solved the mystery, uncovered the truth, and brought the responsible party to justice, but the case left her feeling unsettled. It was a reminder of how quickly things could fall apart, how easily people's lives could spiral out of control. She had seen it many times before, but something about this case felt different. Perhaps it was the small-town setting, the tight-knit community, or the fact that even those who seemed to have everything together could harbor such deep, destructive secrets. In the months that followed, life in Stonebridge slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The church eventually reopened, under the leadership of a new pastor, though attendance was lower than it had been before the tragedy. The scars of what had happened were still fresh, and many found it difficult to return to the place where their beloved pastor had been both their spiritual leader and the center of such a dark story. Linda, though still grieving, began to rebuild her life. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of her loss felt unbearable, but she found strength in her children and in the small acts of kindness from her friends and neighbors. She no longer wore the title of pastor's wife, but she was determined to move forward piece by piece. As for David, his years in prison would be long and difficult, filled with regret and the knowledge that his actions had destroyed more than just his own life. He would never return to Stonebridge, and the town would never forget the role he had played in its darkest chapter. In the end, Stonebridge was left forever changed by the events that had unfolded. What had once been a peaceful, tight-knit community had been shaken to its core, forced to confront the reality that even those who seemed the most righteous could be hiding the darkest of secrets. And while the town would eventually heal, the memory of Pastor Michael Reynolds and the scandal that had surrounded his death would linger in the hearts of its residents for years to come.